Since the start of industry, there had been narrow canals between Liverpool and Manchester, and the famous railway. But to dig a ditch deep as the Suez Canal, to cut a trench wide enough for ocean-going cargo vessels, to steam full of Manchester goods, direct from the heart of Cottonopolis. That was the dream of the Manchester Ship Canal. The ditch was a construction of monumental effort by navvies, an invention by engineers. But the story that's never been told or understood is that it was a Manchester dream that Manchester could do it, raise the money, not just bosses and mill owners, but ordinary working people. Could it? Could it ever have been, though, the People's Canal? During the 19th century, Manchester established itself as a world-class industrial region. But by the 1880s, the economy was moving into a recession. Important manufacturers in Cottonopolis saw a clear grievance as to why Manchester was losing competitive edge. It was said in Parliament that of the charges imposed to get Manchester goods to Calcutta, 60% of it was on the railways and into the Liverpool docks. If Manchester could avoid Liverpool, then there'd be work and jobs and everything hunky-dory again. Liverpool was the villain.
At the time that they were objecting, Liverpool was about halfway through completing the biggest dock development scheme that had been undertaken anywhere in the country up to that time. The investment couldn't be given to people for free. You know, they had to expect to pay for this.
The solution to many Mancunians, though, was simple. Let's have our own docks and a ship canal. Let's bypass Liverpool. Get the shipping of the world slopping into Salford. The dream was brave, but canals were fashionable, like tunnels today. Had not Suez bypassed all Africa? There'd been earlier talk of asking Parliament for permission to cut a deep ditch across the North Cheshire Bog. In the summer of 1882, there was a serious attempt to turn the dream of Ship Canal into reality. To this big house in Didsbury, Daniel Adamson, whose home it was, invited the great and the good. There was a Boddington, John Rylands, a Whitworth, a Dewhurst. There was a man from the Co-op. There was Marshal Stevens, and deliberately invited were the mayors of Manchester and Warrington, Stockport, Stalybridge and Duckingfield. They gathered here, an evening meeting on the 27th of June. They empowered a committee to form a company. The Mayor of Salford got quite overcome. Alderman Husband, he said there'd not be a grander sight under the canopy of heaven than to have docks in Manchester, crowded with shipping from all over the world.
A lot of them were members of the Liberal Party. That was a key element which pulled many of them together. But I think the other thing that interested them was the problem of unemployment and the recession, and Adamson's idea that this was a way of finding a way through the recession and creating some kind of economic regeneration of the region.
Daniel Adamson was a great man of any age, heart of gold and a mind of steel. He was a Liberal and sat on the board of the Manchester and Salford Co-op, but his work was in engineering. He was the inventor of a patent flange seam that was a major development in Lancashire boilers. Engineering was in his family. His nephew Joseph had a foundry in Duckingfield, less than a stone's throw from Daniel's. Joseph's still there, turning out flanges that have stood the test of time, the Adamson way. What sort of man was your ancestor then?
Mad keen on engineering, right from a small boy. Very interested in new things. He'd been involved with the first railway train, started from outside his father's house in Shildon in County Durham. So he'd seen that really right from the start, and he knew how much they could bring to a place in the way of jobs and employment.
What did he want to come to Manchester for then?
Came here for a job, to run a foundry. And then, after he'd been here about a year, he set up his own business.
And he was quite old, and he'd made a bob or two before he got into the ship canal.
Oh, yes, he had. Look at the towers. He wasn't the money. Partly, I think the engineering problems were fascinating, and partly, I think he wanted to give something back to Manchester, because Manchester had been very good to him.
Before any digging of a ditch could be done, the ship canal movement had to get past a proper parliamentary bill. Not everyone supported the idea.
Clearly Liverpool was threatened by what was happening, and thus the problems with the parliamentary campaign. But the other very important area of opposition came from the traditional power holders in Manchester, the merchants. They saw it as being unprofitable, and they reckoned that the chances were that they would have to fork up and put money in through the rates.
Adamson was a clever chap. Was a long-standing member of the cooperative movement. He believed in participation by the working classes. It'd be a campaign, a movement, the ship canal, to rally people in the country and Parliament to support. But also, if enough working men invested in the canal, it'd be the people's, and not beholden to those Adamson so despised, the maggots of capitalism. This populist rhetoric of Daniel Adamson struck a chord among the strong Manchester-based trade unions.
Victorian unionism, certainly until the late 1880s, was a very decent and respectable affair. We're talking about unions of self-respecting, skilled craftsmen, the people who basically saw themselves as at the top of the working class hierarchy. They weren't left-wing, and they believed in the end in some sort of harmony of interest between labour and capital. I mean, if we take a union like the cotton spinners and the leader, Maudsley, when it came to defending the interests of spinners, even against other workers in the cotton trade, were fairly tough cooking. He supported the ship canal because he saw it as relevant to the Lancashire trade, as he saw it as a way of actually boosting the fortunes of the industry, and in his view, anything that boosted the fortunes of his industry was something that would benefit his members if the union played the cards right.
It was a political campaign, the ship canal movement, professionally organised by Joseph Lawrence, with ward committees formed throughout the cotton towns. Meetings had prepared motions put and passed unanimously. Hands up and hands in your handbag, one and all. That was the Daniel Adamson way, or as some of his opponents put it, a mild form of terrorism.
His plan was for the working men of Lancashire to put their hands in their pockets and come up with penny, shilling contributions. This way, they wouldn't need the money of the big money bags of Manchester. They wouldn't need the money from the London finance capitalists. They would be able to do it on their own. And as he put it, they wouldn't have London capitalists gloating over all of the money.
But local Tories were becoming alarmed by Adamson's success.
There was certainly opposition from the Tories in Manchester. They viewed this as something which was being put forward as a liberal project, which would bring working men together with the liberal manufacturers.
Adamson was a clever man. As well as whipping up the mass campaign, he saw the necessity to have some Tory support in Parliament. So when a by-election cropped up unexpectedly in Manchester, Adamson and local Liberals told voters this time, let a Tory in. They'd done a deal with this Tory, William Henry Holdsworth, that if elected, he'd work on the Tories for the Ship Canal cause. Duly elected, he became a key supporter of the bill to get Parliament to authorise the ditch. But despite his work on comrade Conservatives, the bill was defeated in 1883 and again in 1884. The opposition was led by Merseyside MPs. Their argument was that a deep canal would irrevocably alter the water systems in the mouth of the Mersey.
Engineers didn't really understand what controlled the growth and formation of sandbanks, and if they got it wrong, they stood to foul up the whole estuary, which would mean not only no ships for Liverpool, but none for Manchester either.
If you had the ship canal.
Yeah.
After 2 defeats in Parliament, the canal's promoters abandoned the plan for ships to come out into the Mersey at Runcorn. They now propose to bank the canal right round the bend to Eastham. And this scheme was also the way round the Wining from Liverpool Bay.
When the parliamentary bill was finally passed, it had been before 6 separate committees for a total of 175 days of debate. Hundreds of witnesses were examined, and the lawyers' expenses, lavish. 5 guineas a minute in 1885. An American engineer was called from the Mississippi for the Mersey and paid 4,000 nicker just for giving evidence. The total cost of all this hot air was, in today's money, about 20 million.
Victory was to Manchester, celebrated with huge public meetings. In Eccles, a triumphal arch was erected to Daniel Adamson in an ox roast. The band struck up at Piccadilly Gardens, with trade unions and friendly societies marched and rally at Bellevue. Fights in Salford. What everyone looked forward to was bringing the sea to the city. Manchester's ditch was destined to defeat. Parliament had given the Canal Company 2 years to raise the money. Adamson was supremely confident he could attract thousands of small shareholders. Why, he cried, the dividends would never be less than 20%. These and other extravagant claims alienated Lawrence, who resigned as the campaign organiser. Adamson began to skate on thin ice.
Well, it created a mass popular movement, but the people with money weren't convinced that it would make money for them. And of course, the people that it was pitched at, the working men, didn't have the money in their pockets. Many of them were unemployed.
With less than £1 million in the kitty, the board realised the ditch had not be done unless the idea attracted larger investors from the City of London. It'd be against the grain of all of the Adamson instincts to turn here. But surely Manchester had at least one friend among the merchant banks, N.M. Rothschild.
Now, Rothschild's British connection began in Manchester in 1800. Young Nathan, a red-haired, blue-eyed Jewish boy from Frankfurt, came to Manchester and made loads of money. So he settled here and later moved to London. N.M. Rothschild, now a leading bank, launched for the Ship Canal Company the share offer in 1886. Soft spot for Manchester? Maybe, but the share issue flopped disastrously. At this point, the whole scheme to dig the ditch might have collapsed had there not been riots by the unemployed.
Suddenly, it became seen and put forward by Adamson as an idea of public works. This would be a way of dealing with the problems of the unemployment. It hadn't been recognised before, but once you got people crying out across the streets of Manchester, suddenly you started to get people saying this is something that needs to be done to provide work for the unemployed.
Many former opponents now came over to the company, but Adamson, with his ideas of popular capitalism, was seen as an obstacle to attracting the conventional large investors the board desperately needed. Holdsworth, the Tory, was now scathing of Adamson. Proposals to enable persons of small means to take shares. Interesting, but not business. We want to know what large capital thinks of the project.
So they got rid of agitating, self-made Adamson. And the replacement was a very different kettle of fish. Egerton, high Tory, owner of Wythenshawe, Odsal, Heaton Park and this pile at Tatton. The People's Canal had sold out to the toffs. But even Lord Egerton couldn't persuade enough of Lancashire's rich to sufficiently fund the canal. With the parliamentary deadline only weeks away, the company was still £4 million short.
The only place such sums of money might be raised was here in the City of London. N.M. Rothschild lined up a bunch of merchant banks, but many finance houses down here were doubtful the Manchester Canal could ever be profitable.
Once the big capitalists came in, they had to give them the right to take the interest first, the preference shareholders. And surprisingly, the ordinary shareholders were willing to do this. Essentially, they were willing to do this because it meant protecting the big ditch.
This last-minute rescue by big money was a crushing defeat for Adamson's vision of a people's capitalism. It was a blow to Lancashire. When the dust settled, there'd be 4 London merchant banks, Rothschilds, Barings, Morgans and Hambros, who were left with the largest shareholdings.
With the money secured, digging could begin, and the first sod was cut with this very spade out at Eastham, discreetly done for our ditch by the figurehead chairman, Lord High and Mighty Lord Egerton from Tatton.
It was 16,000 navvies who followed Lord Egerton to cut the sod. The construction of the canal provided work for the unemployed. They came from all over. They dug, they used 97 steam excavators, 220 miles of special railway, 170 locos, 6,000 wagons to haul away 53 million cubic tons of earth. Lived in swiftly put-up prefab shanties, townships, specially constructed all along the length of the ditch. Where there was water, workers lived in arks. But it wasn't long before the canal's construction encountered fresh difficulty. Storms caused flooding, the earth fell back in. What was dug had to be redug, and then the main contractor, Thomas Walker, died. As part of his fee, he'd taken a considerable number of shares, and to buy off his executors cost the company $250,000. It was clear money was running out again before the canal was completed. The directors of the canal now turned to the one source of finance that might let them finish the job: local government. The original bill had contained a clause that could allow councils, not just Manchester, to support the scheme. But it was to Manchester the request was made. Please lend us £3 million. Despite the enormous amount requested, when it came before the council in March 1891, no one was surprised it received unanimous support.
They'd been preparing the ground so well over those 10 years, 9 years, that they were able to push it through, and I think that they'd been relying upon that. First of all, they'd infiltrated a number of the councils. You know, they got their members onto it, people who were supporting it. And if you look at Manchester, they had made sure that the platform that people came on was a ship canal platform, so all these people had pent-up support for it.
But soon there were rumours growing that it still wasn't enough. The cat was out the bag. Fraud was alleged. These were new allegations. The directors were milking fat fees. The ship canal was in a pickle.
In December 1891, there was a 2-day meeting of the City Council. John Harwood, a veteran Liberal alderman and great supporter of Manchester's considerably successful municipal undertakings, he spelt out the sorry tale of Ship Canal Company's incompetence. Another Liberal argued that the council should now take it all over. There was fierce debate, narrowly defeated, when councillors who were directors of the company voted, and of course, voted to keep it private.
And finally, Lord Egerton's board, in the spring of 1893, struck a fresh deal. In return for yet another 2 million, they'd allow the City Council to have 11 out of 21 directors on the board. Climb down? Perhaps. But one London preference shareholder confided, the result is very satisfactory. We keep the chairmanship. The council withdraws any claim for shareholder voting power, and we have on the board a compact minority of 10. So, construction was finally completed. The cost had been nearly 15 million, double the original estimate. The scale of the triumph, though, there was no doubt about that. Manchester's future was blessed with a direct link to the oceans of the world.
They could dig the canal deep enough to take the biggest vessels, deep as the Suez Canal, but ocean shipping would still have to pass under railway bridges. So ships too tall had come here to have the funnels taken off. This was the cloakroom for Manchester at Eastham. Take a chimney off, sail on in, collect it on the way back out again. And it was a unique, skilled job, the taker of funnels. Oh, aye, an aristocrat among the working people.
The canal was formally opened for business on 1st of January 1894. The sun shone in Manchester. Glorious. More like a May day than January. A huge crowd lined the banks to see a flotilla, led by the directors of the company on board Sam Platt's yacht, the Norseman, sail up to Salford's new docks. This undertaking, wrote the Manchester Courier, deserves to be called the People's Canal. No one who saw this day is likely to forget when Manchester first opened her gates to the ships of the world. The people went partying once again 5 months later. May the 21st, Empress Victoria came to look on the wondrous world. After a short cruise on her royal yacht, the Enchantress, she made a procession through the streets of Manchester. But the canal, did it really deserve to be called the People's Canal? It had more individual shareholders, nearly 40,000, than any other company in the land, but few of them were workers. The trade unions and co-op, supporters of Adamson's vision, had been, like him, elbowed aside.
The enormous stake taken by the City Council reinforced the idea the canal belonged to the people. But it was a delusion. In reality, they had little control. The directors, displaying a skill noticeably absent in other areas of their management, had infiltrated and outmaneuvered the council. They'd secured dollops of public dosh for a private business dominated by the need to satisfy the interests of the City of London. On the 21st of May, 1894, Empress Victoria stepped aboard her royal yacht, the Enchantress, to officially declare our Manchester Ship Canal open.
Victoria's blessing marked the culmination of a long campaign by Daniel Adamson and Manchester manufacturers to revive the ailing local economy by letting cargo ships steam direct to the oceans of the world from the chimneys of cotton ovens. Adamson's vision was also that the canal could be financed by thousands of Lancashire working people who'd take up the shares. This brave attempt at popular capitalism failed. It was London merchant banks that in the end raised the bulk of the capital. But even then the scheme was racked and nearly wrecked by scandal, extravagance and greed. The ditch would have been left half dug had not a compliant Manchester Council stepped in with massive loans. Nevertheless, the opening of our ditch sparked tremendous optimism in and around Manchester. To bring sea breezes, la mer, to Salford and end all economic difficulties. The euphoria faded when commercial traffic on the canal was slow to materialise. Merchants boycotted the ditch as the railways and Liverpool docks cut their prices. Urgent action was required if the canal were not to be a white elephant. This was a task for the company manager.
2 years after the canal opened, the buccaneering Marshall Stevens struck a deal with a property developer to create the world's first industrial estate at Trafford Park. And 2 years later, the company persuaded a Hartlepool ship owner, Furnace Withy, to create a shipping line that had built its ships specifically for the canal, Manchester Liners.
But profits were slow. The company had difficulty paying the interest due on its loans. Once again, voices were raised urging a municipal takeover.
After a long debate, the council accepted the proposal that the loan be increased by 2 million to cover arrears of interest, and that the money owed to the council, now 7 million, could be considered loans in perpetuity. That is, the ship canal would not be obliged to have to pay them back. At the same time, Parliament passed a law that Manchester City councillors should always be the majority on the ship canal board.
The Daily Telegraph at the time said, this isn't a serious financial deal by the City Council, this is a matter of civic pride. And I think it was, and that's why people put the rates up. I also think if you read between the lines, a lot of the people who were in a company that was going bankrupt were also the aldermen and councillors on the City Council, so they were effectively lending to themselves at highly preferential rates, and they covered that up as being a matter of civic pride.
That deal done, traffic grew steadily over the next 10 years. By 1914, the Port of Manchester was handling more than 5 million tonnes of cargo. Following year, ordinary shareholders at last received their first dividend. After the First World War, tonnages fell. By 1921, back to just 3 million. The answer came in diversifying into oil. The company developed its facilities at Stanlow, down at the Liverpool end. That would keep the money rolling in for many years to come. Manchester Liners developed trade up the St. Lawrence Seaway to the Great Lakes, brought work to the docks in Salford. Its ships were a curiosity, known throughout the ports of the world for being red and custom built to fit the contours of the ditch. After the Second World War, trade took off spectacularly. Tonnage trebled.
Prior to Suez, we had 4 halcyon years in which we handled more volume of traffic than any other port in the United Kingdom except London. The oil dock at Easton, of course, was a huge project when it first came out. It cost £6 million to build the dock itself without any equipment at all, which in the late 40s was a very large sum of money. One of the great attractions about oil, of course, is pumpable. You don't need any labour, other than for rigging flexible hoses and that sort of thing. Its volume, of course, was terribly important to the ship canal company. It also meant that when there were dock workers' disputes and troubles and strikes and so on, one's whole trade wasn't stopped because oil continued to flow.
But the company's investment downstream was not matched by modernisation at the Salford and Pomona docks.
What were conditions like when you started? All hand? Rock?
All hand, all handball, no mechanisation of any description. I think, yeah, we had one stacker truck at 10.9. That was where the Manchester liners had and the back. That was about all the mechanisation they had on the docks.
Manchester dockers worked. They had to. Only fast turnaround could persuade tight-fisted ship owners to take the 6 hours up the canal, turn and back down the tight ditch again.
What were labour relations like?
Nil between men and the ship canal.
Nil?
Yeah, nil. It was only when Devon came in that we got anything like anything reasonable conditions, you know, as regarding washing facilities, reasonable toilets.
The company controlled a small empire, of which Salford docks were just one part. It operated the largest private railway in the United Kingdom, and its own police force. But the success of the 1950s could not be maintained, despite pioneering work by the major port user.
If you look at the efforts of Manchester liners in the 1960s and 70s to actually survive with a container terminal in the heart of Manchester, ultimately it was doomed to failure because you couldn't achieve the economy of scale that was needed with relatively small vessels sailing up and down the canal.
I think one of the problems, quite honestly, was the dock labour situation. We had a lot of labour trouble. And in fact, towards the end, we started putting our ships into Felixstowe.
The minimum wage, that's what they didn't like. They would like to iron fire dock workers back to the old tradition when they could, when they had no work, to lay them off with no pay. That was their ultimate aim, and which we've seen today with the abolition of the Dock Labour Board.
I fought for years to get it abolished, but I'd gone by the time it was abolished. And now, of course, a person engaged in dock work will make himself available any time of the day or night, any day of the week, any day of the year, and work quite heavily.
If in the 60s the docks were often in conflict, a job along the canal side was full of romance. To work for the company, a job for life.
I was working at next to the canal on the Co-op tea warehouse, and I thought, I like them ships. I want to be with them.
Yeah. Who trained you for it then?
Oh, it was a great old guy called Charlie Ayres. Obviously, I think he's long dead by now, but
yeah.
4 or 5 gatemen. But the main one is this Charlie Ayres, I remember. Bandy-legged chap.
Just an old man taught you?
That's right,
yeah. But in those days, didn't there used to be, like, garden competitions and things like that?
Oh, yes, the whole of the locks were a mass with flower beds.
Yeah.
And it was a thriving competition between all the locks, yes.
And now there's none of that?
No, not enough men interested in it.
In 1984, the Ship Canal Company announced its plan to close the whole of the upper reaches of the waterway from Manchester to Runcorn, along with Salford docks. Hundreds of jobs would go.
The Transport and General Workers Union and some of the other unions that were involved said that they wanted support of local authorities that had members on the board, which meant us basically, and they wanted Manchester and the leadership in Manchester to come out quite vehemently against it and support the workers basically, and there was a very, very big argument about what we should do.
We had to argue a particular case within the Ship Canal Company, and all the time, because of company law, we had to bear in mind what was in the interests of the shareholders, so it became a very difficult and complicated discussion.
It's true to say that we could save a lot of money if the upper reaches had been closed to navigation, but of course we were also a water channel. This is one of the big troubles. I mean, the whole land drainage of the vast area actually depended on the existence of the Ship Canal.
So they couldn't close the canal without flooding half of Cheshire. But the dockers and docks at Salford, they got rid of them.
We still believe there was a future for the Ship Canal, for the cargo handling. But people made other decisions. The board made other decisions to develop this dock into what we see today. Round here, I mean, it was a community. There was all families round here had some connection with the Manchester Ship Canal, and we've seen an era ago now.
This is a parcel of land at Dumplington, owned by the Ship Canal Company. They've always owned more land than they needed. This 300-acre site they bought for a song to build another dock. Today it's very valuable, not because it's by the waterway, but because it's by the motorways. The big ships don't come here now. It's the land the company owns that's the key to their future.
During the 1980s, the canal came to the attention of a secretive man from Rochdale who'd been buying up old mills in Bury, John Whittaker.
The Ship Canal Company in those days was seen as a company on the decline, and the real potential hadn't then been realised.
But he'd spotted it.
He'd spotted it early.
Yeah, and you could see it as well.
Oh, we could see it. Yes, it was clear.
The tactics employed by Whittaker were impeccable. He realised that although the preference shares were only half the value of the ordinary shares, and there was no real market for them, because he realised that they carried equal voting rights, he was able to buy up preference shares.
Ironically, Mr. Whittaker's banker, closely advising him, was the very same bank that had written that issue of the preference shares 100 years previously.
It looked a fascinating opportunity. And it was an undermanaged business, and it looked extremely interesting. He very quickly cottoned on to the fact that the preference shares, which stood in the market at a very substantial discount to the ordinary shares, were, in voting terms, as valuable as the ordinary shares.
So it wasn't Rothschild?
It was, no, it wasn't Rothschild.
It was Whittaker?
It was Whittaker himself, yes. I mean, he identified the opportunity.
Lock competition were Latchford locks. To collect the prize on behalf of that lock, Senior Lockmaster Al Hannon.
The company's style of management was traditional, increasingly out of tune with the rougher business ethos of the 1980s, and a soft target for Rochdale man.
Were you caught napping at all? No, not a bit of it. Not a bit of it. We knew what he was up to.
And you wanted to fight him?
Absolutely, we did fight him for long enough.
Why did you want to fight him?
Because we didn't think it was in the interests of the shareholders of the Ship Canal Company that we should be part of any other organisation. We weren't interested in being part of another show, to run our own show.
Canals, Eastham. Hi, Tom. We're still trying to find out from this Gordon Thomas as to where he's going yet, as soon as I get an answer.
The Ship Canal Company then found another player, buying up loads of shares, this time from London, with money made out of dictionaries and a family interest in the Daily Telegraph. Nicholas Berry stepped on board.
I thought they were doing a valiant job, but they had become rather conservative and were perhaps looking at the company purely in terms of a public utility and not in terms of what it could earn in profit or the possibilities from being such a large landowner in the northwest.
The struggle for the company was becoming intense. John Whittaker found his progress blocked by yet another curiosity written into the original constitution, designed to give small shareholders some voting advantage.
Now, this situation led to a ridiculous process known as unbundling. When each side had got large holdings, they each tried then to put their shares in the hands of nominees in packets of 10 each, so that if you got 1,000 shares, instead of having sort of 20 votes, you'd turn it into 100 votes.
He got hold of a large amount of canvassers and sent them round housing estates, offering people £1 notes if they would sign a transfer form to vote in his favour.
I think Nicholas Berry threatened to sort of sign up all the local Sunday League footballers in Manchester, so it became necessary for both sides to seek to obtain proxies.
The result was a vast number of complaints to the company by people who thought they were signing a petition or whatever.
I asked him why we had to sign it 3 times, and he said, well, in effect, you've been a shareholder for 2 seconds.
They've just duped us. I mean, we thought we were signing a petition to keep jobs local, and in actual fact, all we've done is help them gain control.
I recognise the split-down potential, and that wasn't a loophole in the law, that was the law. It wasn't a question of finding some circuitous or devious way forward. That is a legal position, I recognise that, and therefore we split down.
John Whittaker was advancing, but still shunned by the board. To replace as chairman the old patrician Donald Redford, now came old Etonian Nicholas Berry.
I knew from the moment I became chairman that Whittaker was going to get control of the company. But I also knew that I could prevent him getting 100% ownership of it, that eventually those shareholders who stayed would benefit handsomely.
Though by 1987's AGM, a simple majority of shares were in John Whittaker's pocket, it was not enough to give him full control.
That gave him a right to a seat on the board, representing the shareholders of the company. Manchester City Council then still exercised their own control on the board, and they had, of course, in those days, 11 directors on the board.
All those years when we thought the big ditch was ours and it wasn't, did the City Council never debate in our lifetime putting it properly, securely in municipal control?
To be truthful, no. The only time that sort of got half a mention was during this time when the trade unions had asked us over the closure of the upper reaches. But there was nobody really suggesting that we had either the cash or the inclination.
Because it was bailed out in the 19th century and early 20th century by the City Council, because we were known to have a majority on the board, it was always assumed that we owned the Ship Canal Company in some way. And of course, the City Council has never owned a single share.
Although the council had made the loans in perpetuity, so could not expect repayment, John Whittaker now so wanted complete control, he was prepared to make an offer he was sure they'd not refuse.
We didn't pay the money back to get rid of them. We agreed a mutually satisfactory deal where each party gained something from that arrangement. They received £7 million in repayment of their debentures, and we obtained clean board control.
But the reason we actually accepted what was a very good financial deal in its own right was it was becoming increasingly obvious that there was the City Council's interest was no longer having a majority on the board of a ship canal company, that was improving its financial performance. And our interest was really to get that money out, use it to invest in economic schemes in Manchester, and avoid the direct conflicts that there were bound to be and were beginning to felt at that time.
If I was sat there now, to persuade me to go with it, I'd want a lot more than £7 million. I think it was a pittance what we got.
Despite having board control and a majority of shares, John Whittaker needed to own 75% in both categories of shares, ordinary and preference, to be able to use the assets of the ship canal for his purposes. Nicholas Berry, the hard core of small shareholders, were fully aware of the huge potential profits to be made from developing the site at Dumplington. They also knew that John Whittaker's companies were mounting debts. They decided to let him sweat.
Imagine a safe with 2 keys. The outside shareholders had one, and Whittaker had the other, but it required 2 keys to open the safe. So until he could unlock the asset value of the canal and use it in his own companies, it was as though he didn't own any of the company.
I mean, he hung on and he hung on until he forced John Whittaker to pay the price that he, Nicholas Berry, wanted for his shares. Indeed, when the final formula for ending this long-running corporate dispute, one of the longest corporate disputes in Britain, when the formula was eventually put together to end it, Nicholas Berry was the one who thought it up.
It meant that shareholders who held the preference shares would receive 10 times the value of their preference shares in only 6 years before, and those who held the ordinary shares would receive 5 times the value 6 years before. So I felt it was a reasonable settlement and justified my attitude from the beginning.
With Nicholas Berry out the way, control was complete for John Whittaker. The reclusive Rochdalian was unfettered, and he could now develop the company the way he wanted.
And what he wanted was to absorb the canal into his property company, Peel Holdings. No more ship canal shares. The company begun by Daniel Adamson in 1885 had lost its independence.
I don't see the name Manchester Ship Canal ever disappearing. I've no knowledge of, no reason to say that, but I just don't think it would do. I mean, it would be rather hard to sort of talk about the Peel Ship Canal, for instance, wouldn't it?
It hasn't got the same status, has it?
No.
Ironically, the operations of the Port of Manchester are now concentrated in the lower reaches of the canal, often not a spit away from Liverpool, the port the canal was built to bypass. For the rest of it, the future is no longer in labouring docks to take Manchester-made goods across the high seas, but in out-of-town shopping that threatens the heart of city centre Manchester. And Adamson's dream is quite forgot.
Such a bold vision, though, to let the oceans of the world flow up to kiss the shores of Salford. Such a brave idea the founders had, to try and raise new prosperity to this wet corner of England from the pockets of the people. And we almost did it. But clever money won. Not once, but twice. Shilling for shilling, the lion's share of profit. I'll not say we were diddled, but People's Canal, it's a caution that needs to be told. We made it, and it's made us what we are.